impact should look like? Well, it's what's known as controlling the low point, which basically means at the point of impact with the ball, that if you were to draw a line vertically through my left ankle, you would find my left hip, my left shoulder, and my hands all in location upon that line. If you can get yourself into this position, that basically means you've got a really good chance every single time of being able to strike down in towards the back of the ball to get that compression, but also to stabilise the club face. Let's break it down a little bit more. To understand is the importance of the shaft angle, right? Going into something which is known as face plane tilt, but also the importance of controlling the angle of approach. Basically, to speed up that process, what I'm kind of saying is that the importance of the shaft angle returning like so basically means it helps you strike down to compress the ball, but actually also what it does is it keeps the club face more stable coming into the hit. The problem is when the shaft is kind of returning too vertically, one, you're never going to get the compression on the back of the ball, and two, the club face is always going to be very vulnerable of pointing towards the left hand side. Now this is where a lot of questions come in terms of where the hands and where the elbow should be. So let's start talking more about this downswing position now. Obviously, for the benefit of this video, we have to make the assumption that the top of the backswing is adequate. Now what you're trying to do in the backswing is you're trying to put pressure in towards the right heel and you're trying to create leverage, which basically means you're trying to swing the club up. If you can get the weight towards the right heel and you can swing the club up, it would also generally suggest that you're relatively centred. Basically, it just means you're in a position to start working on these sort of events that I'm going to be talking about. Now, priority number one has to happen is that we have to put pressure obviously in towards the left hand side, but we also have to trigger a hip rotation. This is really important. Going back to our low point line, if we start to talk about the hips first, obviously what we don't want to do is we don't want to create too much of a sway or a sliding motion, because as soon as that left hip surpasses that imaginary vertical line through the ankle joint, then basically the upper body is going to have to compensate and drop back. If you kind of start sliding, it's a disaster, because from a side-on perspective, if you create too much lateral movement, it basically means that you're not creating a rotational movement, which in its simplicity means basically you're not getting out of the way. You have to get out of the way. Any other side-on sport, baseball is a good analogy for this, you would be rotating to create speed, but therefore also what you're trying to do is get your lower body out of the way so you can extend your arms coming in towards the hit. Exactly the same thing needs to happen in your golf swing. Your weight is in the right heel at the top of the backswing, you'll shift into the left. From once you've created that shift into the left, now you need to trigger a rotational element to your swing. The easiest way to feel like this is that you're trying to put pressure in towards the left heel. This is really key. Putting pressure in towards the left heel and down into the ground should create flexion on the left knee. You don't want to try and rotate into a leg which is straight, because you just won't have any range of motion and all of a sudden you're going to get stuck in your swing very early on. It's what's known as a stalling move. A stalling move just means that if I kind of try and rotate into a left leg which straightens, it can't move, so then it passes on the event to something else, which is why most golfers end up looking flicky or in an impact position which is not desirable. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to break it down. First thing that has to happen is that we have to put pressure in towards the left hand side and we have to trigger a rotation. As you start this downswing, you're trying to keep flexion in the left knee and you're trying to hold onto flexion for as long as you can, because it's not going to be upon impact until you can start to create a straightening on that left hand side. From a face-on perspective, the lateral move should take your hip over towards that ankle line, and then from there we should be rotating behind it. That's really important. If we can get the lower body and understand the movement there, which I think is the biggest problem with most amateur golfers, that they don't operate the lower body correctly, then we can start talking about the upper body. Okay, so what happens with the upper body? Well, what we've started to do is that we've started to create space. We're creating a rotational element, which means that we're basically moving out of the way. What now needs to happen is that, yes, we are going to be triggering an upper body rotational movement as well, right? We can't just not move the upper body, because obviously we're never going to be able to hit the ball. So you have to rotate the upper body also. The problem that tends to happen with a lot of amateur golfers in this position is that basically as they start coming down, the right shoulder tends to move in this sort of direction. So basically it's not moving correctly. I'll talk about how to move it correctly in a moment. What this then means is that you're going to end up swinging what's known as above plane or over the top, so it's not a desirable position, which again means that you're going to have to release the club early so you can still collide with the ball, again leading to an incorrect or a not desirable impact position. What needs to happen, right? To some extent, you need to go into what's known as an external shoulder rotation, which basically means that the right elbow needs to find its way to try and drive in front of the rib cage coming in towards the downswing. This might feel a little bit kind of unusual, but again, if you were to throw a ball or you were to try and do a baseball swing, you would generally find that you would mimic these movements naturally. In the golf swing, it's important that you do this, right? It's important that you do this for a couple of factors. One, the importance is that basically if we go back into our impact position, to be able to control the shaft angle, the right elbow needs to be located in front of the right hip. So basically at some point in the downswing, it makes sense that the right elbow needs to find its way functioning in front of the right hip coming down. That's what you want to try and do in the transition. So as soon as I come down, yes, I'm rotating my lower body out of the way, but also what needs to happen is I need to drive my right elbow in front of my right hip. What this does is now you can see instead of my right shoulder working its way around, it starts to drop more vertically downwards. This creates a shallowing, which basically means that the shaft is no longer working too vertically, it's actually starting to work more horizontally. All of a sudden, from this sort of position now, we're not a million miles away from where we need to be. The elbow is in front of the right hip. I've triggered a rotation of the lower and the upper body. Now I get a couple of questions about this. From the face-on perspective, what you'd be doing in this movement is a couple of things, right? You are going to be driving the right elbow in front of the right hip. So from the face-on perspective, you can see the way my right elbow materializes very quickly. But also we need to get the left shoulder over towards that ankle joint as well, which is where the rotational aspect comes in. What you don't want to do is you don't want to just create a complete side bend, because obviously you're going to drop behind the ball too much. And if you lose that rotational aspect, you're never going to create as much speed. So what you need to understand is that basically lower body, belt buckle starts to rotate towards the target, so does my chest. I am going to be rotating my chest, it's just that with my elbow driving this way, helps the club stay on plane. That's important to understand. See, all of a sudden now I have a kind of golf swing where as I'm starting to come down, I'm putting pressure in towards that left heel. That means I'm triggering rotation. What's also starting to happen is that I'm driving the right elbow in front of the right hip, which means the shaft is still on plane. This basically means now that the choice is yours, right? You could just hit it, right? So from here, you can then just choose to kind of stand up, release the arms and hit the ball. That's absolutely fine. What you could also argue is the longer I can hold the release, the more powerful I'm going to become. Now what we mean by the release is just the point of the hit. Now this point, it doesn't matter. Like I say, I teach golfers that release the club slightly earlier, meaning that they would get to this sort of position, then hit it. That's absolutely fine, because you're still going to become a very good and competent golfer from that position. The question would be, how do you do things like hit the ball further, and how would you get to impact with even more shaft lean? Well, to do that you have to hold on to the angles for longer, which basically means now I've swung up to the top, left hip starts to work back, right elbow starts to work forward. The more I increase this range of motion, meaning the more I drive the elbow forward and the longer I hold on to the relationship between my left arm and the shaft, and the more I pull my left hip back, starts to introduce more side bend qualities. What this means is, from a side-on perspective, you'll see the way my left rib cage really starts to rise up. So as opposed to just getting here and then hitting, it's kind of getting here, holding, where you can become in the hit because you're storing the energy for longer. Sometimes easier again to picture the baseball player. I'm kind of saying that at the moment, if you do the things I've suggested, you'll get to here and then hit it with your hands and arms. I'm also suggesting that if you want to hold it for longer, you need to increase those movements that I've just talked about, and then you can hit it later. It's hypothetically more powerful. To get towards this impact position, we're not a million miles away. Again, you know, if you can do the rotation, you can do the drive of the elbow, you've got a good chance of getting yourself into transition looking this way, which means that, to be honest, it's unlikely now that you're going to really mess this up. Most common, more amateur golfers are in these sort of positions, which is why impact doesn't look great. Alright? The last little piece of the puzzle is that if you want to hit the ball this way and you really want to get like a sense of drive holding the club, which means that the shaft angle stays stable for longer, then what we have to do is we have to try and get away of the club face coming down squarer earlier in the golf swing. If we can get the club face coming down squarer earlier, it basically means as we're swinging the club on the arc and the club's approaching the ball, you won't need as much rotation of the face. If you don't need as much rotation of the face, it kind of gets rid of the need of so much of a release and a vulnerability of the flippiness. So what we've got so far is that even if we took the golfer who gets themselves into a good position like so, but if the face is a little bit open at this point, you're going to have to do quite a lot of rotation to get it square. This can also cause quite a lot of flippiness. Yeah, so you're not naturally just going to do a rolling release from this position. There's a good chance that you're actually going to flip it still. Like I say, even with those movements I've discussed, down a flip you'd still be good, but you're not going to be as good as maybe you want to. So the last question to kind of answer this like little video is, okay, well, how do we make impact look like this? Well, you have to introduce a rotation around the club face as soon as you possibly can, which means as soon as you start the downswing, what needs to happen is that basically left forearm rotates down, right forearm rotates down, whilst holding on to flexion and extension of the right wrist, and as you drive the elbow forward, basically means the club face won't look this way, it will start to look more this way. Which means the club face can stay more stable coming into that through swing, which means impact would look more this way. To be honest with you, that's more like your choice, you know. Some people quite like the idea of using the hands and arms, some people want to eliminate it. I'm just telling you that's what you need to do if you want to do one route or the other.